This chapter focuses on the first and second steps of the research project, which we reviewed in chapter 1. So the first step in the research process is finding an idea. So you'll be working on that for the next few weeks, but you want to identify a general topic that interests you, and then you want to explore previous research that will hopefully lead to a research idea or question. So for this project, you need relatively limited, you need at least 3 articles, but I encourage you to start saving them. And if you find more, make sure you save them, even if you don't wind up using them. It will be useful to have those tools, and you may need to refer back to them. The second step, once you've figured out your general topic area and research question, is you'll need to form a hypothesis. So as you're working on figuring out what topic you're interested in researching, there are several common sources for research topics. So one is personal interest and curiosity. So is there a particular topic that you want to learn more about, a population or group that you have experience with, or a behavior pattern that's interested you? Another one is casual observation. So maybe you haven't personally experienced something, but things you've noticed or seen in the real world might motivate you to focus on something. Another thing that might lead you to a research project is reports of other people's observations. So maybe you read a news report about something in particular, you've seen a Facebook post or something like that, or you read an academic article. Ideas can come from anywhere, and so these are kind of common places that people start with these ideas. Another kind of route of getting to a research topic is practical problems or questions. So these can stem from daily life. Right, so as a college professor, I've realized that some students really struggle in their classes, and so I've become interested in improving retention among our students. And often, as we're thinking about these kind of more practical questions, it raises this issue of applied versus basic research. So sometimes research is actually categorized into these two groups. Applied research tends to focus more on the practical problem. So this is directed towards solving these problems in the real world. Whereas basic research is often what we think of when we're talking about research. And this involves studies that are intended to solve theoretical issues. So if I was interested in student retention, more basic research would be studying a bunch of students and identifying factors that might predict which of them graduate and which don't. Where a more applied problem or more applied research might be something like developing a specific intervention for students at risk and implementing it at my school and seeing how that helped. Finally, behavioral theories are another source of research ideas. So this involves kind of being motivated by a theoretical background. And that might motivate you to do a certain study. Okay, so once you get kind of a general idea, you want to start exploring the existing research literature. And so this can quickly become overwhelming because the literature is huge, right? So the literature is all of the published information worldwide on your topic. Your job is to identify a handful of studies that directly relate to your research ideas. So you have to kind of be selective about what you pick. So we can take the analogy of kind of entering a party or conversation that's already happened, right? People are already doing research in this area. People are studying it. So as you're narrowing down your topic, you start by kind of eavesdropping on other people by reading what's already been done. And maybe you notice kind of a point in the conversation where there's something lagging. And likewise, in research, you notice, oh, hey, no one has really looked at this angle, or we don't really know how to address this particular component. So as you become familiar with what we currently know about your topic, it becomes easier to identify what you need to learn. It's important to remember as you're kind of figuring out this balance, you don't have to read everything that's ever been published on your topic area. You're just going to read kind of a handful of the most relevant articles. So in terms of starting a review of literature, you need to do your homework, and that's basically collecting background information. So looking at books, most of your resources will probably be journal articles. But it's important to remember you don't have to read everything, and you're not expected to read everything. Basically, the goal here is to read enough to have a decent grasp of your topic, to have a general sense of what the literature has studied, what psychologists have studied related to your topic. You also want to keep an open mind. So your initial idea will change. You need to be flexible and accept the fact that what you initially planned on studying may be modified or revised. So especially in this class where we have limited time and resources, you might have a great idea that we just cannot conduct. So if you find an idea that's easier and more feasible, we might need to go with that. As you're reading literature, you want to be critical. You want to ask questions as you read. You want to think about, oh, hey, they had self-reports of this measure, but maybe we can more objectively measure it. Maybe there are better ways to assess it. And so you want to kind of remember that any published study could have a weakness, but just having a weakness doesn't mean we need to totally throw a study out. So we need to kind of be critical, but also accept the value in each study. And you also want to maintain that degree of flexibility in terms of revising your own project and your knowledge of the field. You also want to focus. So as you're doing your literature review, it gets very easy to be kind of sidetracked and start reading articles that are totally unrelated to what you're actually going to do. So you can't and you don't need to include every possible idea. You just need to kind of pick one set of variables that you're going to explore the relationship between and that you can assess. So kind of narrowing down your research question earlier on in the literature review is very important. And you take it one step at a time. Read one article at a time and constantly be going back and reviewing what you've got and how it relates to your research question. Okay, one important distinction as you're reviewing sources is that the difference between primary and secondary sources. So primary sources are first-hand reports in which the authors describe their own observations. So this is the author describing something that they did themselves. So this is normally an empirical journal article. Also, dissertations fall in this category, although dissertations haven't been peer-reviewed. So you need to be cautious, and I would not recommend using them. So with the primary source, the author is describing something they did themselves. For your article summaries, you need to be using primary sources. Okay, so you need to be using empirical articles where the authors have gone out, collected data, and are describing what they did. Secondary sources are secondhand reports in which the author discusses someone else's observation. So this might be a literature review that somebody has written up. A textbook is a good example of a secondary source, where the textbook authors have reviewed the literature and are describing what we know as a whole. The introduction to a research article is a secondary source as well. So kind of keep that in mind. Secondary sources can be really useful for kind of helping catch you up to speed on the literature in a given topic. So sometimes they can serve as really good starting points. But for this class, when you need to do article summaries, they need to be primary sources where the authors have collected their own data. So this is a nice infographic. I encourage you to pause or go look at the PowerPoint slide. As you're trying to find primary sources and empirical sources for your article summaries, this is a nice way to kind of walk you through it. The big thing you're looking for as you're trying to identify primary sources is, does it have a method, results, and discussion section? And these tell you, if they're describing the method and telling you how many participants completed the study, it's a really good indicator that they actually contacted the participants themselves. Okay. So in terms of the purpose of the literature search, there's two basic goals. One is to gain general familiarity with current research in your area of interest. And the second is to find a set of research studies that are kind of a basis for your research idea. So especially for this class where we have a limited amount of time, the best, most effective way to do this is to find a published study and change one component or one piece. Maybe you find a great study that looked at the relationship between the number of times a student goes to the gym and their GPA, and you say, hey, that's really interesting, but I think rather than the number of times a student goes to the gym, I think really we need to look at the amount of hours that they spend exercising per day and whether there's a relationship between that and GPA. So you've taken this published idea but modified it enough to address kind of a different component of the question, and that is kind of the best way to set up this project. And what you really want to do is find a set of published research reports that kind of define the current state of the knowledge, and this will help you, again, identify that gap that your study is going to attempt to fill. So new research is always kind of growing out of old research, so you have this kind of tree-like structure where you have these historical studies at the foundation that are the basis of this, and then you have these major branching points where maybe different studies lead to different directions in the research, and then current research kind of adds onto that tree and adds more detail to what we know. Okay, so your purpose as you are conducting a literature search is to narrow down a general idea into a specific research question. So you want to find all published information to document and support that question. A good starting point is recently published scholarly sources. Okay, so sometimes you might start with a textbook or chapter headings or subheadings. These might help you more narrowly define your research area, but of course these are secondary sources, so these are just the starting point. Another good starting point is if you find like the perfect article that's so interesting and it's exactly what you want to study, but you can't find any other articles like that, look at the references of relevant articles to identify potential authors or other articles who are doing work in the area. You also want to make note of subject words or key terms, especially if you're not really sure about the keywords for your topic. If you look at the keywords that other authors are using or kind of the phrasing in the text, it can help you get those search words right. You also might make note of authors' names. This is not true for all fields, but in some fields there are kind of leading authors that you see repeatedly cited and repeatedly coming up in the field. And so those are probably people that you're going to be interested in and that you want to cite. So the library presentation will cover a lot more of this. But online databases are one of the best ways that we can find psychological research. Okay, so a typical database, something like EBSCO or PsycInfo, contains millions of publications. They're cross-referenced by subject words or keywords, author names, and you can search by these things, various combinations of them. Sometimes you can search them based on brief summaries. So articles that you find may have just brief summaries, they might just have the abstract, or they might have the full text. The full text is what you want, and what you really want is the PDF full text of an article. So when you find articles, what you need to do, the very first thing you need to do is find that PDF and download it and save it to your computer. That is the best way to guarantee that you can always go back to that article. So make sure, even if you're not sure if you're going to use the article, the best way to make sure that you can get back to it and find it is by downloading that PDF. So I cannot emphasize that enough. EBSCO has ways that you can save articles and email them to yourself. Those links generally stop working and they don't work for other people or on other computers. So please save the PDFs if you can find them. Another important note is often these databases have dissertations, and again, those have not been through the peer review process, so they would not be appropriate sources for your final project. So make sure you're looking at published works. So when you're looking at articles, you're doing a search on EBSCO, as you saw in the library presentation, it's important to remember your main research question and ideas. And as you're reviewing articles, you want to think about whether each article is relevant. If you're interested in whether age at entry into college predicts academic success, and you find an article about whether first-generation college students are more academically successful, that's probably not relevant. And so always kind of thinking back to your main topic is going to be really important, and making sure that you get articles that are specific enough that they will actually be useful to you. So when you're looking at an article, trying to decide if it's what you want, first look at the title. Most titles in research articles are very descriptive, so that should give you a good indicator. If you're doing a research on GPA and exercise, and you find an article about exercise and memory, it's probably going to be a bit of a stretch, and maybe it's not exactly what you want. Next, most online databases include an abstract, and so the next thing you want to do is read the abstract. So take a look at it. The abstract is going to be a brief summary of the article. By reading the abstract, you should be able to tell if this a primary source or a secondary source. If they just say they're going to review the literature, it's probably not a primary source. If they describe a specific number of participants or a specific methodology that was used, those things tell you that yes, this is in fact a primary source. You want to look for the full text version. So I already mentioned this, but when you submit your article summaries, I'm going to ask you to also submit a PDF copy of the article. Okay, so I need to see that you actually have it. So you need to find the full text and find the PDF copies, download them and save them somewhere you can find them on the computer. So what I would do is, while you're doing your search, just download and save a bunch of PDFs of articles you think might be relevant, and then go back and screen them and read them more carefully. Again, you can use references from other articles to expand on your literature search. So this is also something that can be challenging, is deciding when you're done. So the requirements for this project are pretty limited, but especially if you're doing a bigger project, you might have a pretty extensive literature review. And so sometimes it gets kind of hard to cut yourself off. So decide, okay, I'm done. So search is complete generally when you feel comfortable with your knowledge on the topic. So you feel like, yes, I have a very clear understanding of what's going on. And you found a few relevant research articles that are related to your study. So how many articles is enough? Again, for this particular project, you only need to have 3 citations. You know, really what you decide is enough is, do you have justification for your new research project? So if you were doing something more extensive, that would really be the question of, do I have enough? Okay, so finding an idea for a research study from a published research article. So we've already kind of mentioned this, but existing publications often lead to ideas for new research studies. Sometimes this is explicitly done. So if you're reading the discussion section of a paper, an author might say, here's an unanswered question, or here's something someone should do in the future. Here's a limitation of my study that you might be able to address. These kinds of things are totally fair game for your studies, and they're great places to get ideas. So looking at particularly the discussion section of previously published research can give you really good ideas. You might also create a new idea from kind of combining 2 existing results, or use that knowledge of the different components of the research article to look for ideas in the introduction, and the discussion and the references are kind of the 3 best places to kind of get those ideas from previous research. Okay, so hopefully by now you're quite familiar with reading research articles. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you're not really familiar, or you don't feel very comfortable about how to critically read a research article, I encourage you to pause this and review these slides very carefully to make sure that you know what you're looking for in each section of the paper. Okay, so generally the introduction will review the literature and explain the hypotheses. The method will describe the participants and the procedure and the measures. Results will describe the statistics, and then the discussion kind of circles back around the results, describes it in terms of hypotheses, explains what was found and how we interpret it. So the next step is forming a hypothesis. Once we have our research idea, how do we turn it into a hypothesis and develop a research study? So one important component is having a good hypothesis, a high quality hypothesis. So a couple of components, things that we need to be thinking about. One is a good hypothesis needs to be logical. So it has to be the logical conclusion from a logical argument. It needs to make sense based on what we know about the previous research. It needs to be testable. So this is a big one. You need to make sure that all of the variables and events and individuals can be defined and observed and will be measured in your study. So for example, a lot of Freud's hypotheses are not testable, right? We can't ever prove that unconscious desires and motives exist because we can't directly measure unconscious motives. Hypotheses also need to be refutable. So we have to be able to demonstrate, obtain results that either are consistent with our hypotheses or contrary to our hypotheses. And our hypothesis should be positive. So it should make a positive statement about the existence of something. Basically, what this means is you shouldn't have a hypothesis that there's no relationship. So positive doesn't mean good here. It just has to be that there is a relationship. So I would do a study if I had a hypothesis that there is a relationship between age and memory. If I believed that there was believing that there is no relationship between age and memory would not be a good hypothesis. Okay, so a couple of examples of good hypotheses. It's hypothesized that individuals who receive math tutoring will have higher IQ scores than individuals who do not receive math tutoring. Okay, so I can measure whether or not people have received math tutoring. I can measure IQ scores, and I've hypothesized a specific direction here. It's expected that children who drink sugary drinks will do worse on tests than children who drink water. I can measure and manipulate what children drink, and I can look at children's test scores. And again, we have a specific expectation of what the relationship between drinks, which is one variable, and test scores is the other, and we've explained a clear relationship there. It's expected that higher math anxiety will lead to lower research methods grades. So again, I've explained the two variables that are related and the direction in which they will be related. And it's expected that higher optimism will be related to lower depression. Again, we can measure optimism, we can measure depression, and I've explained what direction I expect that relationship to be in. In contrast, we've got some bad hypotheses, and I'd encourage you as I reveal each one to pause and try to think about on your own what might be the problem. So we will test if math tutoring improves IQ. So here I have two testable variables, IQ and math tutoring. But what I have not included here is any kind of direction of relationship, right? I haven't explained the expectation. Is math tutoring going to improve IQ? Do we expect it to? I've just stated what we're going to test. Sugary drinks will affect test scores. So here we have stated that we expect a relationship. We think that the drinks will affect the test scores, but we haven't said which way. Will sugary drinks improve test scores, or will they make them worse? And so you need to make sure that you are clear about the direction that you expect that relationship to go in. Research methods grades are not related to math anxiety. So again, this is one of these expectation of no relationship. Optimism and depression will be related. Again, we have stated the expectation that there's going to be some relationship, but haven't expanded on what kind of relationship we expect to find. Okay, so hopefully by now you are thinking about potential hypotheses for your research study. And again, we will go back and revise them once you've reviewed the literature. So the next steps in the research project, steps 3 and 4, 3 is to identify how the variables will be defined and measured. Okay, so once you've stated your hypotheses and it's clear which variables you are going to assess, you need to figure out how you're going to assess them. And then you will identify the individuals that are going to participate. And so these are what we're going to be doing looking forward. We can develop many different types of research studies from the same hypotheses. So if we were interested in sugary drinks and test scores, we could do an experiment where we give children sugar drinks or not and test their test scores. Or we could do a correlational study where we measure how many sugary drinks children drink and measure what their test scores are. Those are both valid assessments of the same hypothesis. So be aware that just once you figure out your hypothesis, that's not the end of the road. There are still a lot of decisions to be made. So your assignments for this week, chapter 2 is what this lecture was based on. So you need to make sure that you've read that in GNF and also read the APA chapter 4. We're going to start on our SPSS book, the GNS book, Unit 1. For the first few weeks that we're doing this, there aren't any assignments to submit. However, it's a really important review to get you the basics of using SPSS. So please make sure you do it, and do it while you're sitting in front of a computer where you can play around with SPSS and experiment with it. Next, you're going to complete the web literacy tutorial. Some of you may have seen this in other classes, so it might be a review, but we're going to use that as a basis for our online sources discussion. So since we're not in class having discussion in class this week, we're going to do that discussion forum instead, and that will count as your participation grade for the week. And then finally, you're going to submit your final project topic reflection, which is going to be the basis of the groups that I form as we figure out what your final projects will be. So please make sure to submit that. I'm asking that you propose 3 different, they can be related, but generally 3 different project topic ideas, and so you can review the assignment for more details. And then we won't have class on Monday, September 5th, because that's Labor Day. So we'll resume on Wednesday the 7th, and you will get in your final project groups, you'll get to know your group mates, and we'll start figuring out some of the details of that final project.